Tonight's story is not fiction. It's not inspired by real events. It is real. And that's what makes it darker than any horror movie you've ever watched. This is the story behind the documentary series The Scream Murder, a true teen horror story, and what happened on a quiet September night in 2006 in Pocatello, Idaho. It was supposed to be an ordinary weekend. 16-year-old Cassie Jo Stoddart was house-sitting for her aunt and uncle. The house sat in a calm, suburban neighborhood in Pocatello, Idaho, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. Quiet streets, dim porch lights, lawns trimmed perfectly. The kind of place where parents don't worry when their teenagers go out at night. Cassie was responsible, sweet, soft-spoken. She had plans. She had friends. She had a future. On September 22, 2006, she invited her boyfriend over while she watched the house. They ordered pizza. They watched movies. It felt safe. But earlier that evening, two classmates had also stopped by. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk. They were teenagers too, friends. They laughed. They joked. They hung out like normal high school kids. But something about them that night was different. They had already made a decision. They had already planned something, and no one knew. Brian and Tori left the house earlier in the evening. At least that's what Cassie believed. What she didn't know was that they didn't go home. They circled back. They parked down the street. They turned off the lights. And they waited. Inside the house, Cassie and her boyfriend felt uneasy. The power flickered. Strange noises echoed from upstairs. At one point, the lights went out completely. They thought maybe it was a breaker issue, maybe just an old house settling, maybe imagination. They checked rooms. Nothing. But fear has a way of whispering when something isn't right. Cassie's boyfriend eventually left. His parents wanted him home. He offered to take Cassie with him. She chose to stay. She didn't want to abandon her responsibility. That decision would cost her everything. Once she was alone, the house grew heavier. Outside, Brian and Tori prepared. They were wearing dark clothes. They carried knives. They had been recording themselves earlier that day, on video, talking about wanting to feel what it was like to kill someone, talking about horror movies, talking about becoming legendary. They compared themselves to the killers in Scream. They wanted their own horror story. Around 11 p.m., they entered the house through the basement door. Slow, quiet, calculated. Cassie heard something. Footsteps, a creak. She called out. No answer. Then it happened. They attacked her. The assault was brutal, violent, personal. She fought. She tried to escape, but there was no one to hear her screams in that big, dark house. When it was over, the house was silent again. Brian and Tori left the same way they entered. They went back to their car, and they talked about it. On camera. They described what they had done. They sounded excited, almost proud. One of them said he felt like he just killed someone. They buried that videotape later, thinking no one would ever find it. The next day, Cassie's body was discovered. The community was shattered. A teenage girl murdered while house-sitting. No signs of forced entry that made sense. No clear motive. No robbery. It felt random. Terrifyingly random. Police began interviewing classmates, friends, anyone who had seen Cassie last. Brian and Tori were questioned too. They appeared calm, cooperative, sympathetic. But something didn't sit right with investigators. Then came the breakthrough. Detectives learned about a videotape. Brian had mentioned it to someone. A strange comment. A hint. Authorities searched and eventually found a buried cassette tape in the woods. When they played it, the case changed forever. On that tape were recordings made before and after the murder. The two teens discussing their plan, referring to Cassie as the perfect victim, talking about how they wanted to scare her first by turning off the power. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, premeditated. The horror wasn't just the act itself. It was the anticipation, the fantasy, the desire to create fear. When the footage was presented in court, the courtroom went silent. Families cried. The community felt sick. Brian Draper and Tori Adamczyk were arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy. The prosecution described it as a thrill killing, influenced by horror films like Scream. But this wasn't a movie. There was no script, no final girl surviving, no dramatic escape, just real loss. During trial, the defense argued immaturity, influence, youth. But the jury saw the tape. They heard the laughter. They saw the planning. In 2007, both were convicted. They were sentenced to life in prison without parole. No sequel, no redemption arc, just consequences. Years later, the case would be revisited in the documentary series The Scream Murder, a true teen horror story, which examines not just what happened, but how something like this could happen. It asks uncomfortable questions. How do two teenagers move from watching horror films to trying to become one? Where does fantasy end and violence begin? Were there warning signs? Friends later said the boys talked about dark ideas, violent curiosity. But in high school, that can sound like edgy humor, like kids trying to shock each other. No one imagined they would actually do it. That's what makes this story so disturbing. It wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was experimentation. They wanted to feel something. They wanted to create fear. They wanted to leave a mark. And they did, but not the way they imagined. Instead of becoming legends, they became inmates. Instead of a horror franchise, they became a cautionary tale. Cassie Jo Stoddart's name is remembered not as a character in someone else's fantasy, but as a real teenager whose life was stolen in a quiet house in Pocatello, Idaho. A big, dark house, where the lights went out, and two teenagers decided to turn fiction into reality. This story reminds us that sometimes the scariest monsters don't hide under beds or behind masks. Sometimes they sit next to you in class, laugh with you at lunch, and smile for the camera. And that's what makes The Scream Murder not just a horror story, but a true one.